Let's talk about Shavuot. What do we know about Shavuot?
Got the Torah.
So we got the Torah. Do we know anything else about Shavuot?
It's the least observed holiday.
Okay, could be. So the one thing that everybody knows is that that's when we got the Torah. But where does that actually come from? Does the Torah say that we got the Torah on Shavuot? The Torah doesn't actually say it. Actually, nowhere in the Tanakh does it say that on Shavuot we got the Torah.
No? Does it not? Is it not just implied based on the number of days?
Exactly. So you can deduce it. You can derive it from the verses. We know when we came out of Egypt. We know the Torah tells us to count 49 days. Meanwhile, the Torah tells us we received the Torah at Mount Sinai in the third month on this particular day. And if you put two and two together, you say, oh, look, that comes together nicely. So it looks like this holiday of Shavuot is when they got the Torah. But the Torah never openly actually says that Shavuot, you're celebrating that you got the Torah. And like the Torah tells us why we celebrate Pesach. Because you came out of Egypt and blah, 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 blah. But the Torah doesn't tell us why we celebrate Shavuot. We can just put two and two together.
Mention Shavuot?
Yeah. It says so. It's one of the three pilgrimage festivals, right? It's one of the three main holidays. Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot.
But it doesn't ever say that it's...
It doesn't say the reason for Shavuot. So what does it say? What does the Torah tell us that Shavuot is? It's this pilgrimage festival, so you're supposed to come to Jerusalem. And every pilgrimage festival is associated with a harvest. It was with a harvest season. So Pesach is which harvest? It's the barley. Pesach is the start of the barley harvest. Then Shavuot is the wheat harvest. And then Sukkot is the fruit harvest. So there is this spiritual thing here, this classic explanation that from Pesach to Shavuot, we have these 49 days, Sfirat HaOmer, where we're supposed to be refining ourselves, preparing for receiving the Torah. Remember this idea that in Egypt, the Israelites fell down to the 49th level of impurity. Mm-hmm. Okay. And there's 50 levels, and if they would have hit 50, they would have been done. So God pulled them out when they had hit like almost rock bottom, the 49th level. The word tameh itself has a value of 50. Right? Tet, mem, aleph, 941, 50. So the word tameh itself implies that there's 50 levels of impurity. They had fallen to the 49th level. God took them out, and there's 49 days. On each day, they had to purify from another level. And then on the 50th day, they were ready to receive the Torah.
Wait,
and
at what point did they do the calf?
After. First, they received the Torah. They got they heard the 10 Commandments. Moshe went up for 40 days. And then when he came down, at the end of those 40 days, he saw the golden calf. That was Yud Zayin Tammuz, right?
Oh, really?
So after.
I thought he goes up for 40 days, then he brings down...
Exactly. And as he brings it down, he sees the golden calf. But first they heard. They heard the 10 Commandments, right? The Shavuot is the 10 Commandments, the revelation of the 10 Commandments.
Right.
So that's 49 days after the Exodus.
Okay.
So during those 49 days, there's this purification process, and that ties in to barley and wheat, because the classic explanation is that barley is like very coarse and like cheap, and it's basically animal food, barley, whereas wheat is human food. Wheat is something special, it's refined, it's bread, and wheat represents being on a human level. Barley is what was fed traditionally to animals back then. So we start with this, we're basically purifying and elevating from an animal nature up to a more human, more divine level.
Once again, he brings down the Torah.
Right. He brings down the 10 Commandments on the tablets, yeah.
10 Commandments on the tablets. Now, there was a question before, when was the Torah written? And the answer was, it was written, of course, in Sinai.
So that's a misconception. That's a common misconception. The Torah was not written at Sinai, because then they ended up spending 40 years in the wilderness, over which time the Torah narrative continues. Like we're starting this week, Parashat Bamidbar, what happened in the wilderness. And they spent this 40-year period there. And that's all in the Torah. And they were not at Sinai anymore. They've been journeying throughout the wilderness. So during that whole time, Moshe is composing the Torah. And he only finishes it at literally when he dies, right? When he writes the last psukim.
When he finishes the 13 scrolls, so one for each tribe,
Yeah.
12, at the end, 13.
Yeah. No, one for the Ark of the Covenant. in the
And 12
Mishkan,
for the
and 12 for each tribe.
Okay.
Yeah.
So basically, you said also before that they were written parchment, that there was one written in stone.
The Torah says that they put on the borders of the land of Israel, they engraved Torah law in stone. There's a debate whether they engraved the whole Torah, which would be pretty much impossible, or only the main principles. Now, we know historically...
Or maybe the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, probably. So we know historically in those days that was actually common, that other empires as well and kingdoms would put stela, stone pillars, with basically like, like when you drive into a new town, it says this is the name of the town, population 300, whatever, like that. They would put a marker saying you are now entering, Babylonian Empire, the king is this, and a little bit of the story of how great this king is. He's the king of all kings and kings and kings, and this is the greatest place in the world, and here are the laws that you are expected to abide by. So that was normal back then. And we find these kinds of stelas all over, especially in the Middle East. Babylonian ones, Assyrian ones, all kinds. And so the Torah says the same. Basically, do this. At the borders of the land of Israel, you would put these stelas and explain that this is the Holy Land, this is Torah law here, this is the law, that's how you're supposed to behave while you're in this land. So that's the harvest festival idea. So Shavuot's a harvest. Really, that's all that the Torah says. That they would have 49 days where they would wave these sheaves, right? Omer literally is a sheaf that they would wave, bundles of grain that they would wave. And that's a whole separate topic, what it means, that they were waving these things. And then on the 50th day, Shavuot, there would be like a bread offering, loaves of bread being offered. Wheat now, it's the wheat harvest. That's the idea. Then we have this other idea of Shavuot being, so we know that that's when we received the Torah, and there's this metaphor of Shavuot being like a marriage. You've heard this before? Kind of like a marriage. We created a contract, right? We formed a covenant with God. Exactly. So it's like it was like a marriage between the Jewish people and God, and the Torah, or at least maybe the Ten Commandments, but the Torah was the ketubah, was the marriage contract. So the Torah was the ketubah, Mount Sinai was the chuppah, and there's even midrashim that say that it hovered above them. Maybe you've heard that before, like a chuppah. And the Jewish people were like the bride, and God was the groom, and it's like they formed this marriage. And then throughout the Tanakh, that metaphor is used all the time, that God describes himself like the groom, and that Israel is like the bride, and often it's in a negative way, that like you cheated on me, like you were like a wayward wife. But I always take you back. We read it recently in the Haftarah, I believe, that God tells the Jewish people, usually if a woman cheats on her husband, he would never take her back. But I always take you back, right? God tells the Jewish people, I always take you back, even though you abandoned me, but I always take you back. So that metaphor is always, you see that throughout the Tanakh, of God, like as if he's the husband and the Jewish people are like the wife. So there's this marriage. And that actually ties right into this custom of staying up all night on Shavuot.
Why?
So the first place that really speaks about it in depth is the Zohar, as is often the case. And the Zohar says that since this is a marriage, really the Zohar is talking about the Shekhinah, but we're going to leave that aside for now. Since this is a marriage, what happens the day before a wedding? The night before a wedding, the bride is not sleeping. She's too excited to sleep, and she's getting ready. So in the same way, because we're participating in this cosmic marriage, the night of Shavuot, we don't sleep because we're too excited, and we're getting ready for this marriage. And in the Tanakh, we see in a few places, in those days, in ancient times, it was customary for a Jewish bride to be decorated with 24 different ornaments, or garments and jewelry and all kinds of things. 24 different ones. It's mentioned in a few places. Ishayahu mentions it in chapter 3. So he says what they were, that they were chasim and shivisim and sacharonim and netifot and all kinds of things. Bracelets, veils, sashes, all amulets, rings, shawls. There's a whole list that he gives, 24 different things. A corset and a headscarf. So he has a whole list of 24 things. So a Jewish bride was traditionally adorned with 24 pieces of garment and jewelry and so on. And so what do we do on Shavuot night? We also spiritually get adorned with 24 ornaments. And what are our 24 ornaments? What's 24? What do we have that's 24? Books of Tanakh. Right? We have 24 books in the Tanakh. So the Zohar says that our 24 ornaments are the 24 books of the Tanakh. And so by studying them all night on Shavuot, it's like we are adorning ourselves and preparing ourselves for this cosmic wedding. That's the idea. And that's why the tikkun for Shavuot, for the tikkun leil Shavuot, the original study guide, the original study text for Shavuot is basically focused on the Tanakh. The way that the Arizal says to do it is, in general, it's like the first 3 and the last 3 verses of every parsha and every book of Tanakh. That's what you're expected to go through. Today, there's all kinds of other tikkunim, which are very long, and they're almost impossible to do in one night, to go through all the commandments, to do Mishnahs and Gemaras and all kinds of things. But the original tikkun that the Arizal based on the Zohar says that it's really you're focusing on the Tanakh. In another place, the Zohar also says to do also oral Torah. You're supposed to study the written Torah and the oral Torah. And the Arizal says you do these, you focus on the Tanakh, and then you learn other various Kabbalistic things, over the course of the night. So the book that I put together is basically is built on that idea, that it goes through all the 24 books of the Tanakh, and then with commentary on each one. So that way you do the entire tikkun properly, like the Zohar and the Arizal say. Because the commentaries are all from the oral tradition, from like Gemaras and the Zohar and the Arizal. And you actually do the part that you're supposed to do, which is the verses of Tanakh. That's the original way of doing staying up all night. So that's the idea. It comes from the Zohar. And tikkun, actually, the word tikkun itself has a few meanings, right? Tikkun is like literally is in a fixed text to study, but tikkun is also, in Aramaic, it's also that. In Aramaic, a tikkun is also a garment, something that you dress. So literally, like a tikkun is something that you put on. And then also a tikkun means something to fix, to rectify. Usually that word means a spiritual rectification. So over the course of the night, we accomplish a spiritual rectification. And there's different explanations of what we need to rectify. Maybe you heard the one that the Jewish people at Mount Sinai did fall asleep before the giving of the Torah. So there's a way to rectify how they fell asleep and they should have stayed up. Some people say it was a positive thing. They went to sleep because when you sleep, remember sleep is like, dreaming is a 60th of prophecy. So they were really just trying to get closer to God. And there's an idea that when you sleep, your soul ascends to heaven. Yeah. So some people say that in a positive way, some people see it in a negative way, but that's the idea of the tikkun. Now, what I really want to talk about is what we were saying earlier, which is before the Zohar, the first place that we really see mention of staying up all night is from Philo. Philo, 2,000 years ago, Philo Judaeus, Philo of Alexandria, he passed away before the temple was destroyed, before the second temple was destroyed. And he writes about a group of people that would stay up all night on Shavuot. And this is the Theessenes, which he calls a therapeute, or the Theessenes. And they are associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls. We've all heard the Dead Sea Scrolls. So in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we don't know 100% who composed the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it looks like it was this group of people, the Essenes. The way that they're described by Philo and Josephus fits with what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so Philo says that these Essenes, or these people, that's what they would do. They would stay up all night, and they would sing various spiritual hymns and so on, and connect the Torah, contemplate various things.
In the desert? Or what?
Yeah.
Really?
So where the Dead Sea, those caves are, they had a community outside. So their history is really interesting. It looks like they were like a breakaway sect that got fed up with the corruption in the temple and went out and said, we want nothing to do with that. So they just went out far away, created their own village, and separated themselves. And they were very, very pious, very strict in their halachot, and maintained very high standards of purity.
You also found a lot of the Book of Enoch, many things that we don't even
Exactly.
Right?
So that's what I want to get to. Because one of the main books, one of the most common books that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls among the Essenes is the Book of Jubilees, Sefer HaYovlim, the Book of Jubilees. It was really a fascinating book. It's an ancient text. It's written during the Second Temple era, probably, it was never included in our Tanakh, and we'll see why. But interestingly enough, like Ethiopian Jews have it in their Tanakh, or had it in their Tanakh, the Book of Jubilees. Yeah, and clearly the Essenes had it in their Tanakh, because we find it all over the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's one of the most common books.
You said in there that it was said that Moshe Rabbeinu would have written it?
Yeah, so the Book of Jubilees begins by claiming that God took Moshe, when Moshe Rabbeinu went up for the first time, for those 40 days, the day after Shavuot, he went up Mount Sinai. And God, what did God do? He first gave Moshe an entire history of the world. And that's what the Book of Jubilees is. It's basically a history book that summarizes the whole... Exactly.
More detail.
Yeah, it goes through the first almost 2,500 years of history, starting with creation, and it outlines it, and it does it in a very ingenious way. The reason that it's called the Book of Jubilees is because it separates everything into jubilees, into Ayovel, right? 50 years. So remember, a jubilee, just like we count now, 49 days, and Shavuot's the 50th, the Torah says to count also 49 years, and the 50th year is this great jubilee, where everybody goes free, lands return back to their ancestral owners, and slaves go free, and just total freedom is proclaimed over the whole land. So it divides up this whole history up to Sinai, up to the divine revelation at Sinai, into jubilees, into chunks of 50 years. Really chunks of 49 years. Because the 50th year is then the first year of the next jubilee. So year 50, it's not like you have 50 and then year 1. Year 50 is already year 1. Although there is later a rabbinic debate whether it's like that or not, which is an interesting debate, whether it was 50 plus 1 or 49 plus 1, and the 50th is 1. But clearly, the way it was done in those days, it's 49, and the 50th is already day 1 of the next, or year 1 of the next cycle. So what happens is, the Book of Jubilees goes through the first 50 Jubilees of history. So 50 times 49 takes you to the year 2450, right? So 2450 is when the divine revelation would have occurred according to the Book of Jubilees, which actually fits nicely with rabbinic tradition, because according to our official Seder Olam rabbinic tradition, in what year was the divine revelation? 2448. So it's really close. So it's only off by 2 years. So we say, based on our counting, it was 2448, and the Book of Jubilees gives it at 2450. That's really, for when it comes to historical things, to have such a close, let's say, correspondence.
Within that, and the Book of Bereshit, that gives you also the whole history from the beginning, from creation of the world.
So this one is a lot more detailed, fills in, gives you lots more stories.
The Malachi and all that too, no?
Talks a lot of things that later Jewish midrashim would quote from it. So the rabbis never accepted the Book of Jubilees, and we'll see why. But in many midrashim, it's clear that they are actually using it as a source. And this is a very ancient text. It's for sure over 2,000 years old.
Christians love it.
I never heard about it.
Even they don't include it in the Tanakh. Most Christians don't have it in their Tanakh, in their Old Testament, in their Bible, right? They don't include it. It's considered like Apocrypha, right? What's kind of like semi-holy books that were not canonized, but like kind of existed at that time, but were not included for various reasons. But some churches do include it. Okay? The Ethiopian Orthodox Church included it, which is potentially why the Ethiopian Jews included it. In any case, it's a very fundamental, foundational Jewish book. Even though it wasn't included in the rabbinic tradition, 2,000 years ago, it would have been really pretty well known and common, and we see so many of them. I think like 15 copies among the Dead Sea Scrolls of the Book of Jubilees. I think, if I'm not mistaken, 15 copies. Yeah. Now, the reason why was Jubilees not accepted in the Tanakh, other than, let's say, because it was composed after the Tanakh was already concluded. But aside from that, what is the problem of studying Jubilees as a Jewish text? Because Jubilees tells you that the divine revelation, and that's how actually it starts. When did the divine revelation occur? When is Shavuot? According to Jubilees, it's not when's Shavuot for us on the calendar. The 6th of Sivan. The 6th of Sivan, which is 49 days after we start counting. Yeah, we count from the second day of Pesach. And that takes you to the 6th of Sivan. But Jubilee says that Shavuot's on the 15th of Sivan. And it builds this whole history of the 15th of Sivan as basically like the most important day of the year. It says that everything happened on this day. The 15th of Sivan is when Noach made a covenant with God. When God, after the flood, when God made a covenant with Noach, remember that? Noach brought sacrifices, God showed him the rainbow. That was the 15th of Sivan. So the Book of Jubilees says that the very first covenant between God and man was on the 15th of Sivan. When God made a covenant with Abraham and gave them the mitzvah of Brit Milah, was the 15th of Sivan. And Yitzhak was born on the 15th of Sivan. And that was also when Avraham got his name changed. That Avraham became Avraham, it was the 15th of Sivan. So the Book of Jubilees puts the 15th of Sivan as like basically the most important day of the Jewish... It even says that Yehuda, the son of Yaakov, was born on the 15th of Sivan. Arguing that basically like as if all the Yehudim really were born on the 15th of Sivan. Very poetically, that this is the day when we got the Torah and even when the Yehudim were born. And so it makes it the most important, the centerpiece of this whole book is the 15th of Sivan. So that, of course, totally contradicts the rabbinic tradition that Shavuot's the 6th of Sivan. And that's the main reason why it was never included. Now the question is why? So why did they say that Shavuot's on the 15th of Sivan and not the 6th? Because there's actually, 2,000 years ago, there was actually 3 different ways to count Sfirat HaOmer. 3 different ways. Because when the Torah says to count Sfirat HaOmer, it says, Mimacharat HaShabbat. Start counting 49 from Shabbat, Mimacharat HaShabbat. From the day after Shabbat. The question is, what is Shabbat? So we know the way we count it is the way the Prushim, the Pharisees, counted it back then. Which is, we consider Yom Tov's holidays as Shabbats. They're like Shabbat. So Pesach, the first day of Pesach, is a Shabbat. So Mimacharat HaShabbat means the next day, the second day of Pesach. So we count from the second day of Pesach, and that takes us to the 6th of Sivan. The Tzdukim, the Sadducees at the time, did a little bit differently. Mimacharat HaShabbat, they took it, again, they take everything literally, right? The Tzdukim take the Torah literally. No oral tradition, just written Torah literally. Mimacharat HaShabbat means Shabbat. So they say, from the first Shabbat of Pesach, whenever Pesach falls, doesn't matter when, but within the week of Pesach, there will be a Shabbat. So from the next day, meaning from the first Sunday, whenever in Pesach, from the Sunday of Pesach, they count 49 days.
But that would be different every year then.
Different. Yes. In many years, the way the Sadducees counted it, the Tzdukim and the Prushim, it would coincide. Just like this year. Because what happened this year on Pesach? This year, Pesach fell on Shabbat. So if there would have been Tzdukim around, they would have started counting like we count. From the first Sunday of Pesach. We count from Sunday. If you notice, oftentimes Sfirat HaOmer starts on a Sunday. That happens very frequently on the Jewish calendar. So in many years, the Sadducees and Pharisees would have actually had Shavuot on the same day. Or if not, it would have been maybe 1 or 2 days apart. So very close. But the Essenes, the Isiim, the Dead Sea community, they did it differently. They thought Mimacharat HaShabbat means not Pesach. The week of Pesach has to end. And then the first Shabbat after Pesach, so the first Sunday after Pesach, then you start counting. So for the Essenes, they would always do it 1 week after the Tzdukim.
It should always fall the same time as it.
And for them, that would always fall on the 15th of Sivan. They created a whole calendar that was actually the main point of contention between them and the rest of the Jews, the Prushim and Tzdukim, was the calendar. Because the Prushim and Tzdukim went with what the Torah says. You have to look at Rosh Chodesh, and we proclaim Rosh Chodesh, so we go by the moon and by the sun. And the Essenes said, no, that's ridiculous. That's just a mess. Right? That's very complicated. They said we go only by the sun, and we have really clear, strict... the way they had it is, they had 4 seasons, 91 days per season. That works out to 364 days. It's not clear how they did a leap year, how they intercalated for the missing day and a quarter. But they had every year was 300, except for whatever their leap year was, would have been 364 days, 91-day seasons, 13 weeks per season. So it's exact. We have 4 seasons. Each season's 13 weeks. Each season's 91 days. And it repeats 364 days. So every holiday falls on the same day, same weekday, every year. And it was supposed to be like clockwork. And they felt like this is perfect. We don't need people witnesses proclaiming a month, and it always changes based on the witnesses. Very clear, same thing. How they did the leap year, we don't know. Maybe they did it.
To make a leap year?
You have to, because otherwise...
Isn't there 13 constellations, and then that makes it...
No. It's just the year's 365 and a quarter days. So they would lose a day and a quarter every year. So after 30 years, you're a month off. So eventually you'd be doing Pesach in the winter. So how did they keep it in the spring? It's not clear. I haven't been able to find a good answer. It's possible that they waited. The only way it makes sense to me is that they would have waited, let's say, like just enough where they can add a full week. That way, if they add a full week, it doesn't break their being the week, because they have to hit the same weekday. They would start counting always on a Sunday. Right? And then you count 49 days, so it has to always start on a Sunday. It always has to be the same days. So the only way to maintain the same weekday would be to add an extra week probably every few years. So that's the only thing that makes sense to me. But I'm not sure how they had to have done it somehow, because otherwise they would just fall behind very quickly. So that's why the Book of Jubilees wasn't accepted, because it argues for a completely different calendar and a different Shavuot day of the 15th of Sivan. But what's interesting is that we said that the Torah never actually connects Shavuot to the Sinai Revelation. It never does. You can deduce it, you can derive it, but it never openly says so. What is the most ancient text that openly says so? The first known text that actually makes that connection is the Book of Jubilees. So what's interesting is that there's this ancient book that we don't accept, but is the actual earliest known written reference that Shavuot is the giving of the Torah. Again, it would have been known by oral tradition, for sure. And you can derive it from the Torah, but it's never explicitly mentioned there. But it is mentioned in the Book of Jubilees, which is how it begins. It begins by saying on the next day, on the 16th day, God called Moshe Rabbeinu up on Mount Sinai and started telling him the whole history of the world. And the Torah actually tells us that Moshe came down with a Sefer HaBrit when he came down from Mount Sinai. He came back with some book. So Jubilees would probably argue that that was the book, that the Sefer HaBrit that the Torah mentions, that Moshe came down with some book when he came down from Sinai, is this book. And it makes sense, because God would have taught him on his first 40 days on Mount Sinai, kind of like the whole history of the world. Here's what happened, and in extra detail, because the Book of Jubilees goes into really interesting details about all the stories of Yaakov and Esav and the tribes and all these things that the Torah doesn't tell us. It's really fascinating. It's like reading a midrash.
Imagine we're wrong about this. Imagine for a couple thousand years,
Yeah, the Theessenes would argue.
Because apparently whatever we choose and everybody does collectively is what we choose.
Exactly. At the end of the day, this is what we're doing, and yeah, exactly. And God does tell us that we should proclaim the Rosh Chodesh. So it makes sense. What the Pushim and Tzdukim did makes sense as well. That we need to proclaim the Rosh Chodesh, and that's when it begins. God, and that's the deeper meaning behind it, which is a really beautiful message, is that we shouldn't feel like we are slaves to time. Don't think of time as something automatic that we are subject to and that we have to follow. The Torah is trying to teach us that we have the ability to transcend time, that we can be God. God is above time, and we are supposed to be godly, and we have the power to overcome time. We shouldn't be like slaves to time. It's one of the reasons why I don't like wearing a watch, because it makes you feel like you're always tied down, you're stuck to time. You want to be outside of time. So time is really important, but time really ultimately doesn't exist. Today we have scientifically this beautiful idea that time really doesn't exist as an independent entity. That's the whole beauty of Albert Einstein's relativity, that space and time are together. It's a space-time continuum. It's really a fabric of space and time. Time doesn't really exist. It's not a thing, really. Some say there is no time, and maybe there's just change. It's time. Time is something that we invented to track change. but there is no time. And time is there's time dilation. Time will be different depending on, the gravity around you and how fast you're moving. The faster you go, the slower time will feel for you.
The higher you
This-
are, closer to the ground.
Yeah, exactly. So they even have to account. This is a factual thing. Like when they make satellites, because satellites are whizzing around the Earth so fast, in thousands of kilometers an hour, you have to actually account for time dilation because they experience time. It's a small difference. It's like a nanosecond. But again, eventually it would fall behind. So they actually have to account for that. It's a legitimate thing. And you can do this experiment with like very precise atomic clocks. They will run differently at different places, at different speeds. Different gravities will affect how time runs. So time is totally relative. And that was the Torah message a long time ago, that we have the ability to overcome time, that we shouldn't feel like we are subject to time. We all do it. We have all experienced these moments where, sometimes like you do all the stuff, you've accomplished like a million things, and you look at the clock and it's only been like 20 minutes or something, or like an hour. You felt like it must have been like 5 hours, but it only like an hour passed and you're like, oh my gosh, how's that possible? Like a little miracle. Or vice versa, which happens more often, where you feel like it's been like 10 hours, but it's only been 1 hour, and you're like, oh, what's good? Like, you know what I mean? This is so slow. Like you're sitting in shul and it's not ending on Yom Kippur. And so that's how time is, and that's what the Torah message was all along. That don't feel like you're subject to time. You have the power to proclaim the months. The time should follow you. When we say it's the new month, that's when it's the new month. Right? That's the idea. That's the beauty of time. And that's why Jewish time is so complicated. We have a shazmanit, like time is always changing. The length of an hour is changing throughout the year. We don't have these like set time values, and it's always fluid. Time is very fluid. And I think that's the beauty of the message here, that we have the ability to transcend time and in that way be godly. Yeah, that's the idea. Yeah, so we'll end it there.